Good morning, everybody. I'm David Ainsworth, Head of Communications at the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We're here on the 29th of March, the last day of the Geneva meetings. Today, the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will have their final deliberations and close off the last of the meetings. Just to remind you, yesterday, the 28th of March, that's when the Subsidiary Body and Implementation, or SBI, brought their meeting to a close. They had a bit of a marathon session. They spent all the way from 10 in the morning till I guess about almost 9:30 at night, closing up the session. So just to remind you, for SBI, it had its own agenda items, but a great deal of the things they were discussing feed into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In particular, the SBI put forward draft recommendations relating to resource mobilization, the financial mechanism, capacity building, communications, gender plan of action, etc. I think what's important to note is that the discussions on resource mobilization and the financial mechanism are going to require extra work intersessionally before the COP, because it's obvious that parties need to discuss the question of resource mobilization even more. As you remember, the issue of resource mobilization is multi-level. Before we started these meetings, there was the idea that there needed to be raising money of at least $700 billion a year to meet biodiversity goals. That included $200 billion of additional funding, but also this idea of redirecting harmful subsidies to the tune of about $500 billion. So the governments need to discuss that. They need to look at, first of all, that chunk that is official development assistance, which is I think about $10 billion. They need to look at that figure, and then also what can they do in terms of the other remaining amounts of money. The other important part to look at too is the financial mechanism. The Global Environment Facility is the official financial mechanism of the convention, and because of the pandemic, we have a bit of a mismatch between our meetings. So ideally, our Conference of the Parties should provide guidance to the GEF before they do their 8th replenishment, but it turns out that their replenishment meetings will be happening before we finish our COP. So there will be an attempt to manage some of that discussion back and forth. And as you remember, the Global Environment Facility's replenishments have been increasing every year. I think it was $4.1 billion in GEF 7. For GEF 8 that's coming up, they've got a couple of scenarios, anywhere from $5 billion up to about $7 billion. And within that envelope, money's been increasing every year for biodiversity. So the GEF is becoming an important mechanism for that. In any event, it's important to note that there will be a combination of meetings, both essentially informal meetings, both in person and online, to move forward on those discussions before we have the next meetings. The gender plan of action was approved, as was a draft communication strategy. Overall, though, most of the recommendations coming out of SBI contain brackets, which is to say that many parts of them, and this will still need to be discussed at the Conference of the Parties meeting. That's what we'll need to be looking at. Today, the working group on post-2020 framework will resume. We're here, I guess, about 9:25 here in Geneva. At 10 a.m., contact group number 2 will meet again. Contact group 2 is looking at the first 8 targets of the framework. These are the targets that relate to the status of biodiversity. So these are targets that look at how to prevent species extinctions, how to strengthen ecosystems, and how to deal with ensuring that genetic diversity is maintained and strengthened as well. In that case, there are also targets that relate to pollution and to climate change, which are some of the drivers of biodiversity loss. So the contact group will attempt to make progress on that fairly quickly so that a document can be prepared for the plenary, which starts at 3 p.m. Geneva time this afternoon. I think one of the biggest items that will come out of the working group is that you will see an announcement about future meetings of the working group. The Bureau and the governments have agreed, and they will ratify it in the plenary, on a future date of the working group. It's going to be held in Nairobi from the 21st to the 26th of June. Now, just noting to everybody, I'm saying that here, but it's not official until the governments announce it in plenary this afternoon. But that's significant because it means that the work that's been done on the text here is recognized as a first step, but more will need to be done. As far as results, and we'll hear more about that this afternoon from the Executive Secretary and the co-chairs, what's significant from this meeting is that governments engaged with the text. They didn't substantially transform the shape of the first draft of the framework. So while they did have some discussions on the goals and a number of questions about the milestones of this, they didn't eliminate many of the targets. They didn't restructure it. So overall, it means that the governments have taken this on board. And I think it's important to say that when we came into this meeting, this was a text that was really put together by the co-chairs, by Basil Van Havre and Francis Ogwal. But now the parties have taken it onto their own. So, and those of you who looked at the text have seen that there's a lot more. What has to happen next is all of those additional suggestions have to be consolidated and governments have to negotiate, which they will do in the Nairobi time. So as far as things here, so the contact group will not be broadcast, so we'll have to see those results, but between 3 and 6, we'll have the closing plenary. We'll take a look at that text, see what it's at, and we'll get ready to move forward. Our hope is that we can still finish this by 6 p.m. Geneva time, but I mean, there's always with these negotiations the possibility that it would go into the evenings. However, we aren't climate change, so we're not going to go on for another 48 to 72 hours like they typically do. So don't worry about that. The other thing too is at 7 p.m. tonight we will have a press conference here, which will also be live streamed. We'll have the executive secretary, Elizabeth Marema, who will make some comments. We will also have the co-chairs of the post-2020 group, Francis Ogwal and Basil Van Habra. And we also expect to have the participation, I hope, of the chair of Substa, Hezekiah Benitez, and also Charlotte Sorgqvist, who is the chair of the SBI, so we'll have them on board. So those of you who will be in the room, certainly you can ask questions. Those of you online, I'm going to encourage you to send questions on the YouTube channel or also email them to me at david.ainsworth@un.org. We will take questions from bona fide media outlets, but those of you who are following but aren't from a media outlet, you'll have to hold your questions there. Are there any questions from anybody here in the room, any representatives of the press? Questions of clarification, anything else?
Yeah.
Daniela, please.
One clarification about Jeff, the budget. Do you know the period? It's 5 or the 7 billion per year?
Okay, so the period, the replenishments for the Jeff are always, Jeff replenishments always go for a 4-year period. So as we look at it. Yeah, but remember, these are scenarios that I outlined, and they have to be discussed by the Jeff. There's $5 million, or 5 billion, 5.8 billion, 6. You'll have to look in the Jeff site for the specific scenarios, and then indeed communicate with the Jeff. Thanks. Emily? No questions? Okay, very good. Daisy, any question? Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks very, very much, everybody. So good luck. I guess you get to relax a little bit this morning. And those of you online, please feel free to join us at 7 p.m. Swiss time for the press briefing. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.